Ever wondered if robots could walk, talk, even think like us? Let's dive in. I'm Dr. Carl Strathern. This is your inside look at humanoid robotics embodied AI. In this series, we'll explore how lifelike robots are reshaping everything's science daily life. We'll break down how these machines move, learn, and interact, just like humans, ready to meet the future face to face. Hit subscribe and join me as we unlock the secrets of humanoid robotics.
Hello, I'm Carl Strathern. I'm a lecturer in computer science at Edinburgh Napier University. My research is in humanoid robots and embodied artificial intelligence. And it's an area I've been working in for the past 15 years, both building robots, programming them, consulting for international companies, the UK government, and also speaking at the United Nations. I'm going to do this small lecture series, 20-minute clips, of different aspects of humanoid robots that I think are fascinating. Starting with the history, because the history is a difficult history. It's not always recorded and people take it from different points. So this is really an early timeline. This first part is going to split into two. An early timeline and then the more modern timeline of humanoid robots. And we're going to go now to the place that most people start, right? And that's the 1920s. With Capek's Rossum's Universal Robots. And there's a huge misconception in this that people always get wrong. There were no robots in it. Not robots as we consider robots, as in mechanical, machines with intelligence. These were human biological replicas grown in a lab. Because of the derivation of the word robot from the Czech robota, from Capek's play, people often make this mistake. But that's not to say that the play doesn't have lots of concepts in it that are really important to humanoid robots, particularly around task-based interaction. We design robots because we want them to do things for us. We want them to work for us. Not necessarily as slaves, which was the original interpretation of the word, but as assistants. And I always find this interesting. But there are even early examples, okay? There are much earlier examples, and people sometimes start from Leonardo da Vinci's mechanical knight example. Now, da Vinci, he never built the mechanical knight, but he designed it. He drew this clockwork knight. Now, one of the problems with that is it is just a clockwork knight, okay? There's no AI, there is no intelligence behind it. There's no control system behind it. It's literally just a wind-up system that was meant to do things. But we do have much earlier examples of that in the 7th century by the Banu Masu brothers, who were creating automatons, right? Clockwork automatons, mainly driven by water wheels. Incredibly complicated and fascinating machines, most of them resembling humans that, were these interactive displays. And it's incredible to think that way back then, people were still trying to build what we call them automatons, but mechanical representations of humans for entertainment. And I think it's incredible, and we often don't think this far back, but we can go even further back to our early ancestors and think about the ancient people and the effigies they created. Some of them, I've seen some the wooden kind of icons that they were demigods, and they embodied them, they give them personality and give them, a soul. And this idea of giving, an object or a device a soul, a human-like soul, it comes from way back then. So it's always interesting, and I think that people take these things from different points, but the point I take it from has always been from Frank Baum's Ozma from Oz series, a book series. And some of you will be familiar with The Wizard of Oz. Well, the Ozma of Oz was an earlier book of that series. And in the Ozma of Oz, there's Tik-Tok. Some of you will know Tik-Tok from the film, Return to Oz. But Tik-Tok was a human-like robot, and he was able to walk. But one of the key things he could do was tell the time. I think it's such an interesting task, and it's of that time period when people were not able to easily tell the time. Not everyone had a watch. We're talking 1907 here, so not everyone had a watch. And if you want to tell the time, you had to go out usually to a local church and look at the time. And this robot was able to tell you the time. It was able to wake you up. So I think this is fascinating. Again, something that we don't consider. We have Alexa, we have watches, we have lots of stuff around us that we don't really even consider anymore. But at the time, this was a problem. So people usually make another assumption. They talk about Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Now, Fritz Lang's Metropolis is one of the first examples of a humanoid robot in a film. It was a costume. But what people don't know this is 1927. What people don't know is, not many people know, is in 1928 there was a British engineer called Alan Raphael who created Eric, who was electromechanical humanoid robot that could talk and walk, which is incredible. Now, I think the problem here is one of the information of the time and the media. So the medium of the film, obviously it got out to hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. But the robot was a sideshow gaff, and it was only seen by a few hundred people at a time. And we can start to see the problem here. It's quite incredible, and we're talking months apart. Even though the 1927, 1928, in actuality we're talking months apart between these two robots, and you just don't hear that much. It's incredible to think that, yes, we had this robot in film, which was a person in a suit, which is fine, but we actually had a working humanoid robot in exactly the same time period that is usually completely overlooked. And again, I think this is about the power of film, and it's about the media of the time. Okay, and what's even more kind of interesting is if we kind of move on to 1932, we have another robot appear, and it's very much like Eric, but it's called Alpha, and it was built by Harry May in England as well. Now, a slight difference between these two robots. They both look very similar, but Eric was very basic, right? He could do these basic movements, and there was no real interaction with people or human-like gestures. Whereas Alpha, he could wave at people. He would read the day's news from a newspaper, obviously from I imagine an old record or something similar. Record recording. In my head, it's like a gramophone. But again, electromechanical. And now we see a robot that is designed for interaction. And this is another kind of mini breakthrough in this timeline. All these are manually operated robots, okay? They are controlled by somebody. But, they are of the time. So we can imagine these being very kind of rudimentary systems, okay? Wind-up systems. But they also had electromechanical components in them as well. So this is where most people pick up the story rather than the UK variants. They go straight to the American, which was Electro, which is one of the most popular, I guess, humanoid robots. And that was by the Barnetts and et al. At the World's Fair. Again, the World's Fair is attended by thousands of people, lots of the top brass of the time, so it got a lot of publicity and it got out there. But in actuality, the robot itself was way less sophisticated than its UK counterparts. And we're talking quite a few years apart here. We're at 1937 now, from 1932. The robot could do just some bizarre things. It could smoke. It could talk, usually through somebody speaking through like a tube or a speaker system that was into the robot. There was a recording device on there as well, but they used the speaker system a lot, and also the manual controls. And this is considered one of the very first examples of the Wizard of Oz method. Now, I don't think it is. I think the previous robots did use Wizard of Oz. They were manually operated, manually controlled, but here we have the addition of kind of a voice, right? So those who don't know, the Wizard of Oz approach in human-robot interaction is that you have somebody hidden out of view from the audience or the people communicating with the robot, and they operate and speak through or control various parts of the robot out of sight, usually in a completely different room, and the idea is to, replicate if the robot did have these kind of human-like capabilities and it was an autonomous system, but in actuality it's somebody controlling the robot, answering the questions and things, they're just hidden from view to give the illusion that the robot is sentient, for example. Fascinating, right? But it's interesting to also remember that this is from The Wizard of Oz. Now, in The Wizard of Oz, similar idea. The Wizard of Oz, big face on this projected screen, big booming voice, but in reality it's this kind of little guy hidden, out of the view of everybody in this kind of behind this curtain, and he's controlling this thing. So he's given the illusion of being this all omnipotent kind of godlike figure when in reality is just a person. So we see this same thing, but not many people make that connection as well back to the Ozma of Oz as well, with the Wizard of Oz connection. So it's kind of interesting. There's an additional link there with Frank Baum's work that is quite often overlooked. And I think it's kind of important to remember that a lot of these are kind of grounded in literature, because it's something that kind of sticks as we go along. So the next person I want to talk to is Alan Turing, who cropped up in the 1950s. So Turing, I'm not going to go too much into his works. A lot of people know it, and obviously his contributions are still talked about today. I talk about them in most of my computer science lectures. But it's interesting to get Turing's take on robots, because Turing, he wasn't buying it. He, in his book, The Imitation, well, in his report, essentially, The Imitation Game, he talks about dressing up a computer to look like a human as a completely null, silly approach to developing AI, or at the time human-like intelligence, which I agree with, of the time. So the reason why I've been emphasizing the design of these robots as being kind of big metal clunky things, that this is still the robot of Turing's time. And I can imagine him kind of thinking, well, this isn't going to really bring anything. We have this big metal body, this big hulking thing. What's this robot really going to be learning and be able to understand about the world? What's the benefit of it? Whereas I think if he was here now, he would take back that statement. Our understanding of humanoid robots is different, and I actually create the multimodal Turing test as an addition to his Turing test. We now know the body is just one big biosensor, and we do a hell of a lot of our learning through tactile interaction, communication, gesturing, emotions, and these are vital parts of our learning. I always think of a brain in a jar is only going to learn what's around the jar, right? It's never going to be able to truly grasp the world and its understanding. Whereas if you have a body, you can go out and you have all that kind of learning, that tactile, physical learning, which is really important, and one of the stepping stones in kind of our evolution. So that's what I created the multimodal Turing test for, essentially a test of embodied AI, and that test went on to be used by some of the top scientists at the robotics labs in Japan, and they found out that more people believed that AI was sentient if the test was done through a humanoid robot rather than a computer. So that was kind of interesting. But Turing is important because he was really breakthrough kind of thinking regarding automatizing and problem solving using computers, and this plays such an important role in not just AI but in also robotics, and humanoid robotics in particular, because obviously we're grounding a lot of that thinking and emulation on kind of human abilities and human thought and our cognitive processes. So that's really important. Now, between the 50s and 70s, there's kind of a winter of robotics, and humanoid robotics finds a new home, essentially, and that's in comics. The comics of this time period, predominantly humanoid robots either saving or destroying the world. But it's kind of interesting to realize that this idea of developing physical robots and all this kind of push that was going on, especially with like computers as well, kind of stopped. There was a break. And I think that it's interesting that it goes back to literature, and we see humanoid robots almost a step back, if you will, back into kind of comics and those concepts. And they stay there for some time. Humanoid robots don't really pop up again properly in cinema. They do next to care in the timeline in academia. It's one of the significant kind of, I guess, developments, shall we say. So we have the Webot one from Waseda University, created by Keto. And it's a humanoid robot, but it's not got any facial expressions. It's not human-like in kind of its physicality. It does resemble. It's basically a metal frame with legs, arms, and a torso. So in that respect, it does have kind of reference to human anatomy, but it's very square. If you imagine see a child's drawing of a person without a head, that's pretty much what it was. But it was designed to test out the physics, the movement, the joints, that kind of movement, emulating those kind of anthropometric kind of our biological, framework mechanically. So I think it's a very important point in the timeline, but it's also interesting that it's very short-lived and it stops at this point in time. And there's another winter between kind of the 70s and the 90s in academia, and we do have robots obviously in that time period. We're talking humanoid robots just in this series because I think that's more fascinating. But it's interesting that this time period is now the golden age of animatronics in film. And we have people building robots for film. And I mean robots for film. So animatronics, there's always a huge distinction between animatronics and robots when there isn't that much distinction. Animatronics, obviously from Walt Disney's coining of the term audio animatronics, but he actually stole the idea from a European theme park that he visited. And then he brought the ideas back and he created the tiki birds at Walt Disney, and then in Mary Poppins, the singing robin for Spoonful of Sugar, which was the first animatronic to appear in film. But these concepts of robots in film kind of re-emerges again, and we see people like Stan Winston and Jim Henson and some of the guys working on them just doing incredible work, and they do not get the sort of recognition that they should get for the work they did, because they did it completely from scratch, without any basis to anything. They had to design things from scratch. We're talking hardwiring, we're talking analog systems, electromechanical stuff. From scratch, everything from scratch. There was no kind of existing systems to work with in this area, especially when we think about control systems. And their work is incredible, but it's just not given that same sort of reverence as the academics of the later time, because I think it's still classed as cinema and special effects, and we think of them differently. We think of robots for film and live action stuff as not having the same worth as robots in academia or science, but that's not true. And the work I've done, say the work I did with the artificial eyes that dilate to light and emotion, which won quite a few awards, was based on John Copica's designs. I spoke to John, who created the eyes for Jabba the Hutt, and when I did my machine learning for lip synchronization algorithm, I spoke to Matt Wilson, who created the lip sync stuff for the Turtles films, and he also worked on Little Shop Horrors and things. So those guys were designing stuff from scratch, and when I came along, I had something to work with. Mine was all about improving those original designs, but those concepts, a lot of those core concepts, were kind of vital to that development and understanding. You're taking somebody's base framework where they had no points of reference on it, and then you're building on that. So a shout out needs to be said to anybody who worked in animatronics who didn't get that recognition that they deserved, especially in the mechanics and the control systems, and it's just incredible work. So now we kind of move on a bit in our timeline again, and we come back to academia. So I don't think without this idea of film, I mean, film's such an impactful medium, right? And I talk about this a lot in various other things. I talk about Tom Gunning's concept of cinema, like early cinema being very visual and visceral, and you have things like the Lumiere brothers, and then kind of in the 20s to the kind of 50s, film taking on very narrative approach, right? It'd be more like a 12 Angry Men Casablanca style film. And then in the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we have this huge kind of renaissance of animatronics and special effects in films, and we see these unique robot designs, and we have films like The Terminator, Star Wars, you know, Total Recall, all these amazing films come out that really inspired, right, humanoid robots and the core concepts behind them of what they could be used for. And I think this is what revitalizes the interest in academia, because the next robot we see is a social robot, right, in humanoid kind of terms. I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting to learn, because I think the considerations were then more about what robots should be doing, right? How robots should be communicating, what, rather than just how they work, what jobs could they do, like actually thinking about the human anatomy and the social interaction behind them and how important that is. I think that only really came through film, for sure, and the work those engineers were doing. So we see Kismet in 1998 by Brazil MIT Media Lab, and again this is a very expressive kind of robot, very similar to the animatronics of the time, but obviously MIT lab. I'm pretty sure that they had some connection with the Stan Winston Studios when they built it. But again, we're at this point now where we have social robots, and this robot had kind of rudimentary NLP using a computer. So I think it was kind of text to speech kind of stuff, very rudimentary. But this is the turning point, right? And this is where I'm going to end this talk, because from this point onwards, we get more into robots with AI, and we talk about the first generation, second generation, third generation of humanoid robots that have different levels of artificial intelligence. But at this point, we'll say 1998 is just that turning point. Okay, so thank you for today, and I will continue this lecture series if people are interested, and move on to more modern robots next. Thank you.